3 men wearing stolen cavalry badges cornered the trembling shopkeeper behind his own counter, while outside, buzzards circled lazily in the merciless sun, as if knowing death would visit this dusty corner of Arizona territory before days. "And now, friend," the leader drawled, his voice dripping with mock politeness while pressing a Colt revolver against Cooper's temple. "I'm going to ask you one more time. Where's that peculiar old-timer who runs the Crescent Moon Ranch?" He nodded toward the supplies Cooper had been setting aside, extra ammunition, coffee, and medical supplies that seemed excessive for one elderly rancher. Cooper's eyes darted to the door, probably wishing he'd never mentioned the strange old man who'd been buying unusual quantities of supplies lately. I don't know much about him, Marshal Reeves. Just that he keeps to himself, tends his cattle. Nothing special about him." Reeves's laugh reminded Cooper of a rattler's warning. "Nothing special? That simple rancher somehow managed to track and kill 3 of my best men last week. Didn't even leave tracks. Now what kind of ordinary cattleman you know can do that?" Before Cooper could stammer a response, the bell above the store door chimed. A stooped figure shuffled in, shoulders bent with age, his weathered hands trembling. On a gnarled walking stick, Marcus Blackwood, the man they'd been discussing, squinted at the scene before him through rheumy eyes. At 70-some years, he looked every bit the frail rancher they described, down to his patched duster and worn boots. Reeves's men tensed, hands hovering over their guns, but their leader waved them down with a smirk. What threat could this old man pose? The fake marshal's eyes glittered with cruel amusement as he studied the newcomer. The trembling hands, the pronounced limp, the way the old man's breath wheezed with each step. Everything about him screamed helpless and harmless. The Crescent Moon Ranch sat like a mirage in Shadow Fork Valley, nestled between towering red rock formations and the winding path of the Serpentine River. Marcus Blackwood had chosen this spot 3 years ago for its isolation, though he told folks it was for the good grazing land and reliable water source. The main house, built from adobe and local timber, watched over a collection of well-maintained corrals and outbuildings. Everything about it spoke of careful planning, right down to the clear sightlines in every direction. Inside, Marcus moved with the deliberate slowness of age, setting his morning coffee to boil, while his ward, Hannah, kneaded bread dough at the kitchen table. At 16, she had her mother's copper-red hair and a spirit as untamed as the wild horses that sometimes roamed their valley. They'd found each other 2 years ago when Marcus discovered her hiding in his barn, half-starved and running from shadows that still haunted her dreams. "You're thinking awful hard for someone just making coffee," Hannah observed, flour dusting. Her forearms, her keen eyes, sharp as any hunter's, missed little about the man who'd given her a home. Marcus allowed himself a small smile, one that barely touched the corners of his mouth. "Just wondering if Torres's stallion is worth the asking price. Heard could use some new blood. He didn't mention the riders he'd spotted watching his property last week, or the tracks he'd found near the North Spring that belonged to no honest men. No need to worry her with such things." Hannah wiped her hands on her apron, leaving white handprints that matched the ones on her cheeks. "Speaking of horses, Daniel Hawthorne rode by yesterday while you were checking the far pasture. Says his father might be interested in some of our yearlings." Marcus's hand stilled momentarily on the coffee pot. "Daniel Hawthorne, eh? Been seeing a lot of that boy lately." His voice carried a weight Hannah couldn't quite understand. "He's different from the others, Pa. Not like those Reeves boys who keep stirring up trouble in town." Her defense came quickly, but her eyes dropped to the dough. "Besides, he's been teaching me to shoot better." The coffee pot clattered against the stove harder than necessary. "Shooting? Since when do you need shooting lessons?" "Since always. You won't teach me proper, just basic safety rules. Daniel says a girl ought to know how to defend herself out here." Hannah's chin lifted in that stubborn way that reminded Marcus so much of another young woman long ago. Marcus felt the familiar ache in his left shoulder where an old bullet still nestled close to bone. Basic rules keep people alive, Hannah. Anything more than that tends to invite trouble. He'd spent years cultivating this image of a simple rancher, someone whose hands shook too much to shoot straight, the kind of man who'd need help from young Daniel Hawthorne to defend his property. Their morning routine continued, each movement a carefully choreographed dance around unspoken truths. Marcus fed the chickens, his limp more pronounced when Hannah watched from the kitchen window. He checked the fence lines with exaggerated slowness, making sure the hands they'd hired saw nothing but an aging rancher fighting time's cruel march. But in the barn, alone with the horses, Marcus's movements shifted. His hands, steady as desert stone, cleaned and oiled a hidden Winchester. Rifle with practiced precision. The weapon stock bore no initials, but the number of notches along its barrel told stories he'd spent years trying to forget. The ranch hands whispered sometimes about the strange precision of Crescent Moon's operations, how the cattle never seemed to get rustled despite the troubles other ranches faced, how predators mysteriously avoided their herds, how their boss, old Marcus Blackwood, seemed to know about trouble coming before it arrived. "Must be luck," Marcus would say, his voice trembling just enough. "The Lord watches over fools and old men." But the Lord had nothing to do with the carefully placed mirrors in the barn cupola that allowed him to watch the valley approaches, or the cached weapons hidden throughout the property, each cleaned weekly when the hands were away, or the fact that Marcus knew every canyon, cave, and arroyo within 20 miles of his land. When Hannah asked why he'd chosen this particular valley, he'd spin tales about good water rights and fertile soil. He never mentioned how the terrain offered perfect ambush points, or how the river's bend created a natural barrier against surprise attacks. Some knowledge was better left unshared, some skills better left forgotten. Now, as Marcus faced down, Reeves and his men in Cooper's store, he felt those carefully constructed layers of deception beginning to crack. The weight of his hidden derringer pressed against his forearm, while his mind calculated distances and angles with the speed that had once made him famous from Texas to California. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Marcus called out, his voice wavering. "Perfectly. What brings the law all the way out to Cooper's humble establishment?" His rheumy eyes darted between the men, playing the role of a nervous old-timer to perfection, while inside, the legendary gunslinger known as Shadow Hand Morgan began to stir from his long slumber. The time for hiding was drawing to a close, and soon Shadow Fork Valley would learn why some legends are better left undisturbed. The Crescent Moon Ranch cast long shadows in the early morning light, its carefully positioned buildings rising from the desert floor like ancient sentinels. Marcus Blackwood had spent 3 years transforming this patch of Arizona territory into something more than just a cattle operation, though few understood just how much more. Inside the main house, Hannah stirred a pot of beans while watching her adopted father through the kitchen window. She'd learned to read his movements like a book, though lately some pages seemed written in a language she couldn't quite understand. The way he'd checked the horizon before entering any building, how his hands sometimes steadied when they should, shake, the mysterious packages that arrived through Cooper's store, all pieces of a puzzle she hadn't yet solved. "Coffee's ready," she called out, knowing he'd hear her even across the yard. For a man with supposedly failing hearing, Marcus never seemed to miss important sounds. He acknowledged with a wave, his movements deliberately stiff as 2 ranch hands passed nearby. The main house itself told a story if you knew how to read it. Adobe walls twice as thick as necessary, windows positioned to cover every approach, doorways wider than fashion would dictate, allowing for quick movement in any direction. Hannah had once asked why he'd built it this way. "Desert heat," he'd explained, his voice quavering with age. "Thick walls keep it cool." He never mentioned how those same walls would stop most bullets. Daniel Hawthorne rode in just as Marcus reached the porch, the young man's paint horse kicking up dust in the morning light. At 20, Daniel carried himself with the easy confidence of youth, though his gun belt rode suspiciously low for a rancher's son. Marcus noted how the boy's eyes swept the property before dismounting. Not the casual glance of a social caller, but the calculated assessment of someone looking for threats. "Morning, Mr. Blackwood," Daniel called out, all charm and politeness. "Brought those breeding records Pa promised to loan you." His smile was genuine enough, but Marcus caught the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his right hand never strayed far from his holster. Far from "Mighty kind of you, boy," Marcus wheezed, maintaining his careful shuffle as he descended the porch steps. "Hannah, bring our guest some coffee, would you?" As his daughter hurried to comply, Marcus studied Daniel Hawthorne with eyes that had once tracked men across 7 territories. The boy's father, James Hawthorne, had been asking a lot of questions lately. About water rights, about cattle trails, about the strange sounds some claimed to hear from Crescent Moon at night. "Your pa still planning that big drive come fall?" Marcus asked, easing himself into a porch chair with theatrical difficulty. Daniel leaned against the railing, trying to look casual but betraying his tension in a dozen tiny ways. "Yes, sir. Hoping to take the herd clear to California this year." Marcus nodded, calculating distances and timing in his head. California meant the Devil's Backbone Trail, meant narrow passes and blind corners, meant perfect places for an ambush if someone was of such a mind. The coffee would give them time to talk, time for Marcus to assess whether Daniel Hawthorne was truly sweet on his daughter, or playing a deeper game, time to decide if the boy's questions were innocent, or if, like so many others before him, he'd somehow caught the scent of a past that refused to stay buried. Hannah emerged with the coffee, and Marcus watched the interplay between the young people with careful eyes. There was genuine affection there, but something else too, a guardedness in Daniel's manner that spoke of secrets. The boy was too well trained for a simple rancher's son, his movements too precise, his awareness too sharp. "Been hearing strange stories from town," Daniel said casually, accepting his coffee with a nod. "About Marshal Reeves and his men causing trouble at Cooper's store." His eyes fixed on Marcus, watching for a reaction. "Seems they're looking for someone who's been making their lives difficult." Marcus let his hands shake slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. "Trouble seems to follow that bunch wherever they go. Best to stay clear of such matters at my age." But even as he played his role, his mind was working. Daniel's mention of Reeves wasn't casual. The boy was fishing for information, testing reactions. Hannah's voice carried from the kitchen window where she'd paused in her work. "Pa, shouldn't we warn the hands about those men? If they're causing trouble in town." "Now, girl," Marcus cut in, his voice trembling with carefully measured concern. "No need to go worrying everyone about things that don't concern us. I'm sure the proper authorities will handle it." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on him, considering Reeves and his men were about as proper as a rattler in a henhouse. Daniel shifted slightly, his spurs jingling. "Folks say these aren't regular lawmen. Say their badges don't quite match. Up to official issue." He paused, watching Marcus carefully. "Say they're more interested in profit than justice." The conversation was a dance now, each participant moving carefully around unspoken truths. Marcus maintained his facade of aged concern while analyzing every word, every gesture. Hannah kept finding excuses to stay near the window, drawn to Daniel's presence, but also watching the interaction with growing curiosity. And Daniel Hawthorne continued his careful probing, each question seemingly innocent, but building towards something larger. In the distance, a dust cloud marked the approach of more riders. Marcus's keen eyes, belying their aged appearance, picked out details that set off warning bells in his mind. 5 riders, moving with military precision, their horses' gaits suggesting well-trained mounts rather than simple ranch stock. "Looks like we might have company," Daniel observed, his hand unconsciously moving closer to his gun. The gesture wasn't lost on Marcus, who noted how the young man had positioned himself to cover both the approaching riders and the house's blind spots. "Just some travelers, I expect," Marcus said mildly, though his mind was already calculating angles and distances to his hidden weapons. "Hannah, best get inside and see to that bread before it overrises." His daughter started to protest, but something in his tone, a hint of steel beneath the quaver, made her comply. The approaching riders were still too far for normal eyes to make out details, but Marcus saw enough. The way they spread out as they rode, the glint of metal that suggested more than just normal trail gear, the deliberate pace that spoke of men trying not to appear threatening while closing the distance to their target. "Might be best if you headed home, boy," Marcus suggested to Daniel, his voice still maintaining its elderly tremor. "Don't want your pa worrying if you're late for chores." Daniel hesitated, clearly torn between his assigned role, whatever that might be, and genuine concern for Hannah's safety. "Maybe I should stay, sir. Extra hands might be useful if those are the men from town." Marcus let his rheumy eyes fix on Daniel with sudden sharpness. "Son, there are times when helping means staying clear of trouble." The words carried a double meaning that wasn't lost on the young man. "Besides, I expect your pa will want to know about our visitors." Understanding passed between them, though neither acknowledged it openly. Daniel mounted his paint with fluid grace that spoke of more than ranch work training. "I'll tell him, sir, about the visitors." He hesitated, then added softly, "and about how the shadow seems to be lengthening over Crescent Moon." Marcus kept his expression neutral, but inwardly the use of that particular word, shadow, set off new alarms. Nobody in Arizona Territory should know that name. Yet Daniel had dropped it deliberately, like a pebble in still water, watching for ripples. As Daniel rode out, taking a path that would keep him screened from the approaching riders, Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. The layers of deception were getting complicated. His own, Daniel's, probably James Hawthorne's too. Soon, he suspected, all these carefully maintained facades would begin to crack. The riders were close enough now to make out details. They wore cavalry uniforms, but something about them wasn't quite right. Marcus had spent enough time around real cavalry to spot the inconsistencies in their gear, the way they carried themselves more like hunters than soldiers. Time to prepare for another performance, but this one might have to end differently than his usual shows of frailty. Sometimes maintaining a lie meant being ready to kill for it. The 5 riders pulled up short of the main house, dust settling around their horses' hooves in the morning heat. Marcus counted 4 Winchester rifles and noted how their hands rested casually near holstered revolvers. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a cavalry captain's insignia that didn't quite match his weathered appearance, studied the ranch with calculating eyes. "Morning, gentlemen," Marcus called out, letting his voice waver with age as he struggled to rise from his chair. "Long ride from Fort Callahan." He noted how the men exchanged quick glances at his mention of the fort, the nearest military post that they were presumably from. "Captain James Miller," the leader introduced himself, touching the brim of his hat. "Tracking some deserters who've been causing trouble in these parts. Thought they might have passed through here." His accent was wrong for a cavalry officer. Too much Texas drawl, not enough West Point polish. Marcus made a show of squinting against the sun. "Ain't seen any deserters, Captain. Just my hands and young Daniel Hawthorne, who rode out a spell ago." He shuffled forward, leaning heavily on his walking stick. "Though I expect you already saw him on the trail." Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. The old man shouldn't have been able to see that far, not with the way he squinted and stumbled. "Sharp eyes for a man your age, Mr. Blackwood." Marcus Blackwood, eyes might be failing, but ears work fine. Heard your horses coming from a fair piece off. He gestured vaguely toward the house. Might offer you boys some coffee, but my girl's busy with the baking. Inside, Hannah watched through the window, her hand gripping the Spencer carbine Marcus. Kept hidden behind the flour barrel. She'd found it months ago, but never let on, understanding instinctively that some secrets were best kept even from those you loved. Actually, Mr. Blackwood, Miller dismounted with fluid grace that spoke of experience in far more dangerous situations than ranch visits. We're more interested in some strange reports from town. Seems someone's been interfering with certain business arrangements in the territory. Marcus let his hands tremble as he gripped his walking stick tighter. Terrible thing, trouble in town. Reason I stay out here most days. Peaceful like. His roomy eyes tracked the other riders as they spread out, taking positions that would give them clear shots at the house's approaches. They were well trained. He had to give them that. Peaceful, Miller agreed, his smile never reaching his eyes. Except for those 3 men found dead last week. Professional work according to Marshal Reeves. Clean shots, bodies arranged to send a message. He moved closer, boots crunching on sun-baked earth. Kind of work that reminds some folks of older times, times when a certain gunman used to operate in these parts. Hannah's breath caught as she watched from the window. Something in Miller's tone had changed, become more dangerous. She'd never seen anyone see through her father's carefully maintained facade before, but this man was picking at its edges like a scab. Afraid I don't know much about such things, Marcus wheezed, shuffling back slightly. News travels slow out here. But his mind was racing, calculating angles and distances. Miller's men had positioned themselves well, but they'd made one critical mistake. They'd assumed the house was the only threat. Strange thing about those dead men, Miller continued, moving closer still. Each one shot through the left eye, clean as whistle, despite being in the middle of a firefight. His hand rested casually on his holstered Colt. Reminded me of stories I used to hear about a man they called Shadow Hand Morgan, way he could shoot with his left when his right was occupied. The name hung in the air like gun smoke. Marcus felt Hannah's shock radiate from the window. She'd never heard that name before, certainly never connected it to her trembling, gentle father. Sounds like quite a tale, he managed, his voice still quavering. But surely that was before. My time, man that age would be long dead by now. Miller's laugh was hard as trail gravel. Funny thing about legends, Mr. Blackwood. They have a way of coming back when you least expect them. He nodded to one of his men, who produced a folded paper from his saddlebag. Got something here might interest you. Telegram from Texas Rangers, responding to our inquiries about those dead men. Marcus watched the paper unfold, knowing what was coming. His mind raced through options. He could maintain the facade, but Miller was too sure of himself. The man had come prepared for a confrontation. Seems those men were part of a gang that operated in Texas 20 years ago, Miller continued. Gang that disappeared after crossing paths with Shadow Hand Morgan, all except 3 members who managed to escape. His eyes fixed on Marcus. Same 3 men found dead last week. Hannah's grip tightened on the Spencer carbine. She'd never fired it at a person, but watching these men threaten her father made her finger itch against the trigger. Through the window she saw movement in the barn. Their ranch hands were aware something was wrong, taking up positions. Out of sight. Quite a coincidence, Marcus offered mildly. Indeed. Miller took another step forward. But here's where it gets interesting. Before they died, those men were asking questions about an old lawman who vanished around the same time. Morgan did. Man named Matthews. The name hit Marcus like a physical blow, though he kept his expression neutral. John Matthews had been more than just another lawman. He'd been the one who'd given Marcus his chance at redemption, who'd helped him disappear after that last bloody day in Texas. The fact that Miller knew that name changed everything. Don't recognize the name, Marcus said carefully. Though at my age, memory ain't what it used to be. Miller's smile turned predatory. No? Let me help you remember. John Matthews was the one who arranged for Shadow Hand Morgan to disappear. Helped him create a new identity, buried the paperwork, man of principle by all accounts. He paused significantly. Until someone made him change his mind. Understanding bloomed in Marcus's mind. This wasn't just about the 3 dead men or old vendettas. Miller was working for someone who'd learned the truth about Matthews, someone who'd forced the old lawman to reveal secrets he'd kept for 20 years. Those men didn't just happen to find their way here, Miller continued. They were sent, just like we were sent. Someone very interested in finding Shadow Hand Morgan is willing to pay handsomely for information about his whereabouts. His hand moved closer to his Colt, or his remains. The threat was clear now, the pretense of military authority abandoned. These men weren't here to arrest anyone. They were hunters, hired to eliminate a legend that someone still feared after. All these years, Hannah had never seen her father move so fast. One moment he was trembling, leaning on his walking stick. The next, the stick had split open, revealing a hidden shotgun barrel. Miller's draw was fast, but Marcus was already diving aside, his first shot catching one of the mounted men square in the chest. "Hannah, now!" Marcus bellowed, his voice carrying none of its usual quaver. His daughter didn't hesitate, the Spencer carbine barking from the window and sending another rider tumbling from his saddle. The peaceful morning erupted into chaos as hidden ranch hands opened fire from concealed positions. Miller's remaining men returned fire, bullets splintering wood and throwing up dust clouds. Marcus rolled behind a water trough, emerging with a Remington revolver that seemed to materialize from nowhere. "Shadow Hand Morgan," Miller called out, ducking behind his horse. "Should have known the legend was true. No ordinary rancher builds a place like this." His gun barked, sending splinters flying from the trough. Marcus's response was 3 rapid shots that sent Miller scrambling for better cover. "Should have done better research," he called back, his voice now carrying the hard edge of command that had once made him famous. Shadow Hand Morgan never missed with his left. The implications of that statement sank in just as Hannah's second shot rang out from the window, catching Miller's last remaining man in the shoulder. They'd been so focused on the legend of Shadow Hand's left-handed shooting that they'd never considered it might have been a deliberate misdirection. The morning sun climbed higher over Crescent Moon Ranch as the carefully maintained peace shattered like a mirror, revealing the deadly truths hidden beneath its reflecting surface. The time for pretense was over. Shadow Hand Morgan had returned. Miller crouched behind his fallen horse, blood seeping from a graze on his arm, where Marcus's last shot had come closer than expected. The morning air was thick with gunsmoke and tension, while around the ranch, hidden defenders held their positions with practiced discipline. "You've prepared well, Morgan," Miller called out, his facade of military authority completely abandoned. "But you're still outnumbered. Reeves and his men are already on their way. You really think you can take them all?" Marcus's laugh carried an edge sharp as a razor. "Seems to me your numbers are dwindling pretty fast." He glanced toward the house where Hannah maintained her position, the Spencer carbine ready, pride mixed with regret in his chest. She'd handled herself well, but this wasn't the life he'd wanted for her. "The girl shoots well," Miller observed, trying to keep Marcus talking while he assessed his options. Wonder what she'd think if she knew the truth about her beloved father. About the trail of bodies Shadow Hand Morgan left across 3 territories. Inside the house, Hannah's grip tightened on her rifle. The name meant nothing to her, but the way Miller said it, the way her father had reacted, it carried weight. Through the window, she saw Marcus shift position, his movements now fluid and deadly, nothing like the trembling old man she'd known. "Tell me, Miller," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Who really sent you? Those 3 men last week? They were just bait, weren't they? Someone wanted to flush me out." He kept his Remington trained on Miller's position while his mind worked through implications. Someone who knew about Matthews. Miller's response was a harsh laugh. "You really don't know, do you? 20 years thinking you'd buried the past, and you never realized what was really happening that day in Texas." He shifted slightly, and Marcus's warning shot kicked up dust inches from his boot. "Stay still," Marcus advised coldly. "Next one won't miss. Now talk. What about Texas?" "The Hartley Gang massacre," Miller said, naming the day that had supposedly ended Shadowhand Morgan's career. 15 men dead in less than 10 minutes. Official reports said they'd killed each other in a dispute over stolen gold. But that's not what really happened, was it? Marcus felt old memories stirring. Gunsmoke and blood, the weight of betrayal heavy as lead. They were warned. They chose poorly. They chose exactly as they were meant to, Miller revealed. The whole thing was a setup from the start. The stolen gold, the gang dispute, all arranged to bring Shadowhand Morgan out of retirement one last time, to make sure the job was done properly. Hannah watched the exchange intently, seeing her father's reaction even as he maintained his aim. Something in Miller's words had struck home, touched a nerve she'd never known existed. "Who?" Marcus demanded, his voice carrying an edge that made Hannah shiver. "Who arranged it?" "The same man who's arranging this," Miller replied. "The man who spent 20 years building an empire while you played rancher. The man who sent John Matthews's daughter to find you." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. "Sarah Matthews came looking for me?" Miller's smile was cruel. "Oh, yes. Quite the resourceful young woman. Spent years tracking down every rumor, every whisper about Shadowhand Morgan. She's convinced. You killed her father, you see. Wants revenge almost as much as her employer wants you dead." Marcus's mind raced. John Matthews had helped him disappear, had been his friend. The idea that someone had gotten to him, had forced him to reveal the truth before killing him, it changed everything. And Sarah, just a child when Marcus had known her, now hunting him. "Hannah," he called out, keeping his voice steady. "Get the box from under my bed, the one I told you never to touch." He heard her hesitate, then her footsteps moving away from the window. Miller used the opportunity to shift position slightly, but Marcus's warning shot froze him in place. "Wonder what else the girl will find," Miller taunted. "How many secrets have you buried in this ranch, Morgan? How many lies have you told her?" Hannah returned to the window, a weathered wooden box in her hands. "Found it, Pa." Her voice carried uncertainty now, questions she'd never dared ask before bubbling to the surface. "Open it," Marcus instructed, never taking his eyes off Miller. "There's a letter inside, sealed with red wax. Read it." Hannah's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The paper was old, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. Her voice shook as she began to read. "My friend, if you're reading this, then they've finally found me. Everything I feared has come to pass. The corruption runs deeper than we imagined, reaches higher than we dared suspect. I helped you disappear not just to save your life, but to preserve hope. Hope that someone would remain to fight when the time came." "John Matthews's last letter," Miller interrupted, "written just before they killed him. But did he tell you why they killed him, Morgan? Did he explain what he discovered that made him send you into hiding?" Marcus's voice was deadly quiet. "Keep reading, Hannah." "The Hartley Gang massacre was engineered," Hannah continued reading, her voice growing stronger as understanding dawned. "They needed someone with your reputation, someone who could eliminate 15 witnesses without raising suspicions. The gold they stole wasn't from any bank. It was government money, intended to fund a secret war against the tribes. But someone diverted it, used it to build a network of corruption that spans territories. The man who arranged it all," Miller added, "now controls 3 territories from the shadows. Judges, marshals, governors, all bought and paid for with that gold. John Matthews discovered the truth, tried to expose it. That's why he had to." "Die," Hannah's voice caught as she reached the letter's final passages. Sarah, my daughter, if you're reading this, don't trust what they tell you about Morgan. He wasn't my killer, he was my friend, perhaps the last honest man in a world of corruption. The evidence you need is hidden where they'll never think. To look on the land of a simple rancher who's more than he appears. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across Crescent Moon Ranch. In those shadows, Marcus saw 20 years of careful planning beginning to unravel. He'd built this place not just as a haven, but as a fortress to protect. Secrets that powerful men would kill to keep buried. So now you know, Miller said quietly, why they can't let you live, why they sent Sarah Matthews to find you. The girl thinks she's avenging her father, but she's just another pawn in their game. Hannah, Marcus called out, his voice gentle despite the tension. In that box, beneath the letter, there's a badge. Show it to me. Hannah lifted the tarnished star, its silver surface catching the sunlight. Texas Rangers, she read aloud. But Pa, I don't understand. Your father wasn't just Shadow Hand Morgan, Miller explained, a note of genuine respect entering his voice. He was a special investigator for the Rangers, working under John Matthews to expose corruption in the territories. The legend of the left-handed gunslinger was just a cover, a way to move freely while gathering evidence. The truth hung in the morning air, like smoke after gunfire. Marcus Blackwood, the trembling old rancher, and Shadow Hand Morgan, the legendary gunman, both were masks worn by a man whose real mission had never ended. Reeves and his men will be here soon, Miller warned, and Sarah Matthews won't be. Far behind. Time to decide, Morgan. Keep hiding behind this facade, or remember who you really are. Marcus's response was cut short by the sound of distant hoofbeats. Riders were approaching from the south, too many to be just Reeves and his men. The game was changing, and the carefully maintained peace of Crescent Moon Ranch was about to shatter completely. The approaching riders emerged from the desert haze like specters, their numbers growing as they drew closer to Crescent Moon Ranch. Marcus counted at least 15 men, with more dust clouds suggesting others following behind. Through his experienced eyes, he noted their formation. Not the loose grouping of common bandits, but the disciplined spacing of trained men. "Looks like your reinforcements arrived early, Miller," Marcus called out, though something about the approaching riders' pattern didn't match his expectations. Miller's response confirmed his suspicions. "Those aren't my men," Miller said, tension evident in his voice. "That's not Reeves' riding style." He shifted behind his fallen horse, now as much seeking cover from the newcomers as from Marcus. Hannah's voice carried from the window, tight with concern. "Pa, there's more coming from the east, and I think I see riders on the north ridge." Her Spencer carbine swung between potential threats as she tried to cover multiple approaches. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. This was more than a simple hunting party or even Reeves's band of corrupt lawmen. This was starting to look like a military operation. "Hannah, get word to the hands. Tell them to fall back to their secondary positions." The positions he'd spent years preparing, hoping they'd never be needed. As Hannah disappeared from the window, Marcus kept his Remington trained on Miller. "Seems like your employers aren't the only ones interested in Crescent Moon Ranch today." "This wasn't part of the plan," Miller muttered, more to himself than Marcus. "Sarah was supposed to arrive first, draw you out." His words trailed off as a single rider broke away from the approaching group, advancing under a white flag. Marcus felt his breath catch as he recognized the figure. Even after 20 years, he knew that straight-backed posture, that distinctive way of riding. "Daniel Hawthorne," he called out, letting his voice carry across the yard. "Or should I say, Ranger Hawthorne." The young man reined his paint horse to a stop at a careful distance, his badge now visible in the morning sun. Not the fake badge of Reeves's men, but the real star of the Texas Rangers. "Seems like we've all been wearing masks, Mr. Blackwood." Hannah reappeared at the window, her face a mixture of hurt and confusion as she saw Daniel's badge. "You lied to me." The pain in her voice cut deeper than any bullet. "Not about everything," Daniel replied, his eyes meeting hers. "My feelings for you were real, are real. But yes, I'm a ranger, been working undercover, trying to protect you and your father." "Protect us?" Hannah's laugh was bitter. "By spying on us? By keeping others from finding you before we could?" Daniel corrected. He turned to Marcus. "John Matthews was my mentor too, sir. Trained me himself before they killed him. Told me if anything happened to him, I should look for signs of Shadowhand Morgan. Said you were the only one who could finish what he started." Marcus studied the approaching riders with new understanding. "Those aren't just rangers behind you?" Daniel nodded. "U.S. Marshals, territorial agents, even some Army scouts, everybody who's still honest, everybody who's been waiting for a chance to clean up the territories." His face hardened. "We've spent years building a case, gathering evidence, just like you and Matthews did 20 years ago." Miller's laugh carried a note of desperation. "You really think you can change anything? The corruption goes all the way. To Washington, you'll all be dead before sundown." "Maybe," Daniel agreed. "But Shadowhand Morgan's reputation wasn't built on taking easy fights." He turned back to Marcus. "Sir, we need you. Not the rancher, not the legend, but the man who taught John Matthews that one honest lawman could make a difference." The moment stretched like a drawn bowstring as Marcus weighed 20 years of careful planning against the need for action. He'd built Crescent Moon Ranch as a fortress, a place to protect secrets and innocence. But fortresses, he remembered, could also be bases for counterattacks. "Hannah!" he called out, never taking his eyes off Miller. "In that box under the badge, there's a key. Bring it to me." As his daughter complied, he addressed Daniel. "You should know Sarah Matthews is coming." Daniel's face showed no surprise. "We know. She's been working with us for the past month, ever since we showed her the real evidence about her father's death. The man who killed John Matthews is the same one who's been building this empire of corruption. The same one who arranged the Hartley Gang massacre." Marcus felt pieces clicking into place. "Governor Morrison." "The same," Daniel confirmed. "He used the stolen gold to buy judges, marshals, even other governors. Built himself a kingdom while hiding behind respectability. John Matthews discovered the truth, but they killed him before. He could expose it." Hannah emerged from the house, the key clutched in her hand. Her eyes met Daniel's, still hurt, but beginning to understand. "All those shooting lessons needed to make sure you could protect yourself when this day came," Daniel finished. "Your father's been training you too, whether you knew it or not. All those safety rules were really combat techniques disguised as basic instruction." Marcus accepted the key from Hannah, studying it in the morning light. "This opens a room beneath the barn. Everything John Matthews and I gathered, every piece of evidence about the corruption, it's all there. Been adding to it these past 20 years, every time I had to deal with problems. Like those 3 men last week," Miller interjected. "The ones who recognized you?" "They weren't just looking for me," Marcus revealed. "They were carrying documents, evidence of payments, names of corrupted officials. Seemed sloppy at the time." His eyes narrowed as he looked at Daniel. "You arranged that, didn't you? Used them to pass information?" Daniel nodded. "Had to find a way to get you proof about Morrison without exposing our operation. Knew you'd search them after." He left the rest unsaid. The sound of more approaching riders drew their attention. A cloud of dust to the west resolved into a group of mounted men, led by a woman with flame-red hair. Even at this distance, Marcus recognized Sarah Matthews, though she'd been just a child when he'd last seen her. "Time to choose, sir," Daniel said quietly. "Keep hiding behind the facade, or help us finish what you and John Matthews started." Marcus felt the weight of his Remington, familiar as an old friend. He thought of John Matthews, of corrupted governors and honest lawmen, of a young girl who'd grown up believing lies about her father's death. Mostly he thought of Hannah, who'd have to live in whatever world they created today. "Hannah," he called out, his voice carrying none of its usual quaver. "Get my Winchester from the barn, the one with the notches." He turned to Daniel, standing, straighter than he had in years. Time to remind them why they feared Shadowhand Morgan in the first place. The morning sun cast long shadows across Crescent Moon Ranch as forces gathered for what would become a legendary battle. In those shadows, Marcus saw not just threats, but opportunities, chances to right old wrongs, to fulfill promises made in blood and honor. The time for hiding was over. Shadowhand Morgan was back. Sarah Matthews reined her horse to a halt, 30 yards from the ranch house, her posture as straight as a cavalry officer's. 20 years had transformed John Matthews' little girl into a formidable woman, her father's determination evident in every line of her face. The morning sun caught the silver handle of her custom-made Colt, a weapon as precisely maintained as her father's had been. Behind her, a dozen riders spread out in a practiced formation that spoke of careful planning and long preparation. "Marcus Morgan," she called out, her voice carrying across the sun-baked yard. "Or do you prefer Blackwood now?" Her hand rested casually near her holstered Colt, but she made no aggressive moves. Her eyes swept across the scene, Miller still crouched behind his fallen horse, Daniel with his rangers, Hannah at the window with her Spencer carbine. Each detail was assessed and catalogued with professional precision. The wind kicked up dust devils across the yard, making shadows dance as Marcus studied her face, seeing echoes of his old friend in her features. The same steel in her eyes, the same unwavering sense of purpose. "Been a long time, Sarah. You've grown into your father's daughter. Have I?" A hint of old pain colored her words. "Spent 20 years trying to live up to his memory, trying to understand why he died." Her gaze shifted to Daniel, "Until your young ranger here showed me the truth, showed me how deep the corruption really goes." Miller's laugh carried a desperate edge, dust caking his blood-stained sleeve where Marcus's shot had grazed him. "Truth's a dangerous thing, isn't it? Makes people do crazy things. Like a legendary gunman hiding as a rancher, or a daughter hunting her father's friend instead of his killer." "Shut up, Miller," Sarah snapped, her words sharp as a whip crack. "Governor Morrison's paid lapdog. How much did he promise you to, or keep his secrets? How many honest men have you killed to protect his empire?" Her words carried the weight of new understanding, of recently discovered betrayals that had transformed her world. Marcus kept his Remington ready, but shifted his attention between the various forces surrounding his ranch. Sarah's men were positioning themselves carefully, not quite allied with Daniel's rangers, but not opposing them either. More riders were appearing on the ridgelines, some wearing badges, others in plain clothes, but moving with military precision. Each group maintained careful distances, like wary wolves circling a common prey. "Quite a gathering," he observed mildly, though his mind was calculating angles, distances, fields of fire. Everything he'd built into Crescent Moon Ranch over the years had been for a moment like this. "Governor Morrison must be getting nervous." "Should be," Daniel replied, adjusting his position to better cover the approaches to the ranch house. "We've spent years building this coalition. Every honest lawman, every incorruptible judge, every agent who refused his bribes, all waiting for the right moment to move against him. Some of these men have been undercover so long they've almost forgotten what it's like to wear their real badges." Hannah's voice carried from the window, directed at Sarah. "If you know the truth now, why come in force? Why surround our ranch like this?" Her hands remained steady on the Spencer, but her voice carried hurt, not just from Daniel's deception, but from the realization that her whole life at Crescent Moon had been built on carefully maintained lies. Sarah's smile was grim as desert. "Hardpan, because Governor Morrison's men are less than an hour behind us. Nearly 50 riders, including that snake Reeves and his whole corrupt bunch. They're coming to burn this place to the ground, destroy the evidence before we can use it. Evidence that could hang half the territory's officials. From his position, Marcus could see his ranch hands maintaining their hidden posts, weapons ready but waiting for his signal. He'd chosen each man carefully over the years, looking for specific skills, for the ability to keep secrets. Now he nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. So this isn't just about justice for John. You're using me as bait. Using us all as bait, Daniel corrected, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Morrison thinks Sarah's still working for him, thinks she's leading him to Shadowhand Morgan. He doesn't know about the Rangers, about the federal marshals waiting in the hills, doesn't know we've been planning this for months, positioning our people, building our case. A trap within a trap. Miller mused from his position, blood seeping through his fingers where he clutched his shoulder. Clever, but Morrison's no fool. He'll have prepared for complications. When you've built an empire on corruption, you learn to expect betrayal. Sarah's eyes hardened like gunmetal in winter. Like you, Miller? His insurance policy. She drew her revolver with stunning speed, but instead of aiming at Marcus or Daniel, she pointed it at Miller. Show them what you're carrying. Show them how Morrison plans to signal his hidden forces. Miller's face twisted with fury, but he slowly reached into his vest with his free hand, withdrawing a small metal cylinder. Marcus recognized it immediately. A signal flare, military issue, the kind used to coordinate cavalry movements during the war. Backup plan, Sarah explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. If Miller couldn't handle things quietly, he was supposed to signal Morrison's main force. They're probably already in position, watching through field glasses, waiting to see which way the wind blows. Which is exactly what we wanted, Daniel added, sharing a knowing look with Sarah. Had to make Morrison commit his forces, expose his whole corrupt network at once. Can't cut off a snake's head if you don't know where it's hiding. Hannah's voice carried new understanding, though her rifle never wavered from its coverage of Miller. That's why you've been coming around so much, teaching me to shoot. You were preparing us for this. All those lessons about sightlines and cover, you were training me for a battle. Preparing you. Daniel corrected softly, genuine emotion, breaking through his professional demeanor. Your father already knew what was coming, didn't you, sir? Marcus allowed himself a grim smile, remembering all the careful preparations, all the hidden caches and escape routes built into his ranch. Suspected something was brewing. Too many familiar faces showing up in town, too many questions about old times. When you've spent 20 years watching for shadows, you learn to spot them gathering. He turned to Sarah, seeing John Matthews in the set of her jaw, the unwavering determination in her eyes. Your father taught me that sometimes the best way to spring a trap is to let it be sprung, to let your enemy think they have you cornered until the moment you reveal your true strength. Sarah holstered her revolver with practiced smoothness, her face softening slightly. He used to talk about you, you know, even when everyone thought you were dead. Said you were the smartest lawman he ever knew. Said you could read a situation, like most men read a book. Smart enough to keep evidence of Morrison's corruption safe for 20 years. Marcus agreed, his mind already working through the coming battle. Smart enough to know when it's time to stop hiding and start fighting. Back. The sound of distant hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. More dust clouds appeared on the horizon, Morrison's men approaching from multiple directions. The governor was indeed taking no chances, bringing enough force to overwhelm any normal. Ranch, time to decide, Sarah said urgently, her horse shifting beneath her as more riders appeared on the horizon. That evidence you and my father gathered, we need it now. Combined with what we've collected over the years, it's enough to bring down Morrison's whole empire. Every corrupt judge, every bought lawman, every crooked politician who's profited from his schemes. Marcus turned to Hannah, seeing the questions in her eyes, but also the strength he'd carefully nurtured over the years. Every shooting lesson, every rule about situational awareness, every story about justice and duty, all of it had been preparation for this moment. Get my Winchester, girl, and bring the strongbox from beneath the floorboards in my room. His voice carried none of its usual quaver now, only the authority that had once made him legend. Time you saw what your old pa's really been protecting all these years. As Hannah disappeared into the house, Marcus addressed the gathered forces, his tactical mind assessing positions and advantages. Morrison will have men in those hills already, probably been watching for days, waiting for this moment. He turned to Daniel. Your rangers in position? Daniel nodded, touching the brim of his hat. 3 teams in the high ground, another dozen spread through the arroyos. U.S. Marshals have the North Ridge covered. Every man handpicked, every position chosen to crossfire with our defensive setup here at the ranch. Good. Marcus's mind worked through angles and options, recalling battles long past. Sarah, your people know the signals, the fallback positions if things go wrong? Just like we planned, she confirmed, her voice carrying the same commanding tone her father had used. They'll move when we do. Every man knows his role, knows what's at stake. We've waited too long for this chance to waste it now. Miller watched this exchange with growing unease, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes still calculating. You're all insane. Morrison has 50 men, all experienced killers. Even if you survive this fight, his corruption reaches all the way to Washington. You'll never be safe, never be able to rest. He'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. Maybe not, Marcus agreed as Hannah returned with his Winchester and the strongbox. The rifle felt familiar in his hands, its weight a reminder of battles long past. The strongbox contained 2 decades of carefully gathered evidence, proof of Morrison's crimes, of the corruption that had infected 3 territories like a slow poison. The Winchester's action worked smoothly as he checked it, each motion practiced until it was as natural as breathing. 20 years of playing the frail rancher hadn't dulled his skills. If anything, the daily practice in secret had honed them to a razor's edge. Daniel, Marcus called out, his voice carrying the authority of command. Get your rangers into position. Sarah, spread your people along the ridgeline. We need to make this look good when Morrison's men arrive. He turned to Miller, whose eyes widened in sudden understanding. As for you, before anyone could react, Marcus's left hand produced a derringer from his sleeve, the shot catching Miller's shoulder and spinning him into the dust. Can't have. You're warning them too soon. Pah! Hannah's voice carried shock, but also growing understanding. Every lesson he'd taught her, every rule about gun safety and proper handling, had been preparation for this moment. She saw now how he'd trained her in combat techniques, disguised as basic instruction, building her skills while maintaining his own facade of weakness. Time you knew the whole truth, girl, Marcus said softly, the derringer disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. About who I am, about what this ranch really is. He nodded to Sarah. Your father and John Matthews built something 20 years ago, a network of honest lawmen, working in secret to fight corruption. When they killed, John, I had to disappear, had to protect the evidence while Sarah grew up, while we gathered allies. And now? Hannah asked, her voice steady, despite the tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. Now we finish what they started, Sarah answered, her eyes fixed on the approaching dust clouds. We bring down a corrupt governor, expose his whole network. She smiled grimly, and we remind them why they feared Shadowhand Morgan. The sound of approaching riders grew louder, like distant thunder rolling across the desert. On the horizon, dust clouds merged as Morrison's forces converged on Crescent Moon Ranch. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as honest Lawmen and corrupt killers prepared for a battle that would shake 3 territories to their foundations. Marcus checked his Winchester one last time, then turned to his daughter. His voice carried all the authority of the legend he'd once been, tempered now with a father's pride. Ready to learn what those shooting lessons were really about? Hannah's answering smile was fierce as a desert hawk's. Born ready, Pa. The legend of Shadowhand Morgan was about to be reborn in fire and justice. The time for hiding was over. Desert sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across Crescent Moon Ranch as Morrison's forces approached from all directions. Through his Winchester's scope, Marcus counted more than 50 riders, their movements precise and coordinated. These weren't common bandits or corrupt lawmen. They were trained killers, each chosen for their skill and ruthlessness. Main force approaching from the south, Marcus reported, his voice carrying none of its former quaver. 2 flanking groups moving through the arroyos to the east and west. They're trying to cut off our escape routes. Sarah Matthews nodded grimly, her own field glasses trained on the approaching riders. That's Reeves leading the main group, Morrison's pet killer. Her voice carried personal hatred. Reeves had been one of the men who'd murdered her father. Got movement in the hills too, Daniel added from his position near the barn. Sharpshooters, probably. They're setting up crossfire positions. His rangers had already taken cover, their horses hidden in the specially built corral that shielded them from sniper fire. Hannah maintained her position at the upper window, the Spencer carbine ready. Pa, I count at least 10 men on the ridge to the north. They're not moving with the others. Morrison's insurance policy, Marcus explained, pride mixing with concern at his daughter's tactical awareness. If things go wrong, they'll try to burn the ranch, destroy the evidence before it can be used. He turned to Sarah. Your people, in position, ready and waiting. She checked her Colt one final time. Once Morrison shows himself, we'll have one chance to spring our trap. If we miss, we won't, Marcus assured her, though his mind was working through contingencies. 20 years of planning had taught him to prepare for every possibility. Daniel, signal your rangers. Time to make this look convincing. Daniel raised a small mirror, flashing a coded signal to his hidden men. Immediately, several riders appeared on the western ridge, making a show of fleeing the ranch. It was a carefully choreographed performance, honest lawmen pretending to be corrupt agents abandoning their posts. Reeves is taking the bait, Hannah reported, watching through her scope. His flanking groups are moving to cut off the retreating riders. Marcus allowed himself a grim smile. Morrison's forces were reacting exactly as predicted, spreading themselves thin to chase what they thought were fleeing traitors. Sarah, your turn. Sarah Matthews stood in her stirrups, her voice carrying across the yard with parade ground authority. This is your last chance, Morgan. Surrender now, and maybe the governor will show mercy. The performance was for Morrison's hidden observers, but Marcus couldn't help admiring her acting skill. Just like her father, Sarah knew how to play a role when needed. He raised his voice in response, letting it quaver with age and fear. Please, I'm just a simple rancher. I don't know anything about any evidence. Even as he played his part, Marcus was noting positions, calculating angles. Morrison's men were moving into the killing zones he'd prepared over years of careful planning. A new rider appeared on the southern approach, a well-dressed man on an expensive horse, flanked by 4 guards. Even at this distance, Marcus recognized Governor Morrison. The man's presence here meant he was either very confident or very desperate, perhaps both. That's far enough, Sarah called out as Morrison's group reached the outer edge of the ranch yard. Her voice carried authentic authority now, dropping all pretense. Governor Charles Morrison, you're under arrest for corruption, conspiracy to murder, and treason against the United States government. Morrison's laugh carried across the yard, rich with arrogance and assumed power. My dear Miss Matthews, I think you've been spending too much time in the sun. I'm here on official business, investigating reports of criminal activity. His smile was colder than a desert night, though I'm curious why you've chosen to show your hand so dramatically. Because she's not working alone, Marcus called out, straightening to his full height, all pretense of age and weakness falling away. Hello, Charles. Been a long time. The governor's face showed genuine shock as he recognized the man beneath the rancher's disguise. Morgan, shadow hand, Morgan. His composure cracked slightly. You're supposed to be dead. Supposed to be a lot of things, Marcus replied, his Winchester trained steadily on Morrison's chest. Just like you're supposed to be upholding the law, instead of corrupting it. John Matthews figured out what you really were 20 years ago. That's why you had him killed. Morrison's guards tensed, hands moving toward weapons, but Sarah's voice cracked like a whip. I wouldn't. Take a good look around you, gentlemen. Notice anything strange about those rocky outcrops? The ones my father's killer failed to search. Properly. As if on cue, U.S. Marshals began appearing on the ridgelines. Not the 10 men Hannah had counted earlier, but closer to 30. Each position had been carefully chosen years ago, built into the natural landscape of Crescent Moon Ranch. Quite an elaborate trap, Morrison observed, though sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the morning chill. But you seem to be forgetting something. I have 50 armed men surrounding this ranch. One word from me and what? Daniel interrupted, emerging from his position with his ranger's badge gleaming in the sun. Those 50 men are already surrounded, have been since before dawn. Marshal Carter? A tall figure stepped out from behind the barn, the legendary federal marshal who'd been hunting Morrison for years. Governor Morrison, I have here warrants for your arrest signed by the territorial judge and the U.S. Attorney General himself. We've been building this case for years, gathering evidence, turning your own men against you. Evidence. Morrison's laugh carried a brittle edge. What evidence? The ravings of a disappeared gunman? The desperate claims of a dead marshal's daughter? No judge will— How about your own records? Marcus nodded toward the strongbox Hannah had brought out. Every transaction, every bribe, every murder ordered. John Matthews kept copies of everything. Been adding to that collection myself over the years. Every time one of your men got careless, Morrison's face darkened with fury. Reeves! Burn this place to the ground! Kill them all! But Reeves and his men had their own problems. Hidden Rangers and U.S. Marshals had emerged from their positions, covering Morrison's forces with well-aimed weapons. The hunters had become the hunted, surrounded in a trap 20 years in the making. Your men are outnumbered 2-1, Sarah informed Morrison with grim satisfaction. Honest lawmen from 3 territories, all tired of watching you corrupt everything they swore to protect. It's over. Morrison's composure finally cracked completely. His hand darted toward his coat, drawing a hidden derringer. Sarah's Colt seemed to materialize in her hand, but it was Hannah's shot from the window that sent the governor's weapon spinning into the dust. Nice shooting, Marcus commented proudly. Told you those lessons would come in handy. The morning sun climbed higher over Crescent Moon Ranch as federal marshals moved in to take Morrison and his men into custody. Sarah Matthews watched with tears in her eyes as her father's killer was finally brought to justice. Daniel's Rangers secured the surrounding area, rounding up any of Morrison's forces who tried to flee. But it wasn't over yet. Marcus kept his Winchester ready, knowing that desperate men were capable of desperate acts. 20 years of planning had taught him that victory often came with a price. He was right. The first shot came from the North Ridge, where Miller had somehow managed to reach his hidden men despite his wound. The corrupt agent's signal flare lit up the morning sky, and chaos erupted across Crescent Moon Ranch. The real battle was about to begin. Take cover! Marcus shouted as rifle fire erupted from multiple positions. Miller's hidden men had been waiting for this signal, and now they opened up with everything they had. Bullets kicked up dust across the ranch yard as Morrison's loyalists made their desperate last stand. Hannah's Spencer carbine cracked from the window, dropping one of Miller's men as he tried to maneuver for a better shooting position. Sarah dragged Morrison behind a water trough, keeping him alive for justice rather than vengeance. Daniels. Rangers returned fire with disciplined precision, their practiced volleys keeping the attackers' heads down. "Pa!" Hannah called out urgently. "More riders coming from the east! At least 20 more!" Marcus cursed under his breath. Morrison had hidden reserves after all, probably stationed out of sight until the signal flare called them in. Even as U.S. Marshals moved to intercept the new threat, more gunfire erupted from the western ridge. "They're trying to split our forces," Daniel observed, ducking behind a barrel as splinters flew from the barn wall beside him. "Create enough chaos to free Morrison." "Not going to happen," Sarah declared grimly, her Colt barking twice and sending 2 of Miller's men tumbling down the rocky slope. She'd learned to shoot from her father, and now she put those lessons to deadly use. Marcus watched the battle unfold with the experienced eye of a tactician. Morrison's men were well-trained and desperate, but they were fighting against a carefully prepared defense. Every approach to Crescent Moon Ranch was covered by multiple firing positions, every retreat route blocked by hidden lawmen. "Hannah," he called out, his voice carrying over the gunfire. "Remember what I taught you about counting shots? Time to put it to use. Watch the North Ridge. When they reload, that's our chance." His daughter's response was 2 rapid shots that sent Miller's remaining men scrambling for better cover. She'd learned more than just accuracy during those practice sessions. She'd learned to think like a gunfighter, to read the flow of battle. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the battlefield as the fight intensified. Morrison's reinforcements had reached the edge of the ranch, but Marshal Carter's men met them with devastating, accurate fire. The sound of gunshots echoed off the rocky hills, turning Crescent Moon Ranch into a storm of lead and smoke. Through it all, Marcus Morgan moved with the deadly grace that had made him legend. Gone was any pretense of age or weakness. Shadow. And Morgan had returned, and his Winchester spoke with authority. Each shot found its mark, each movement put him in perfect position to support his allies and protect his daughter. 20 years of planning, of building this fortress disguised as a ranch, were finally paying off. But the price of victory would be high. Already, several Rangers lay wounded, and Marshal Carter himself was bleeding from a graze along his temple. The battle for Crescent Moon Ranch had begun in earnest, and before it ended, more blood would soak into the desert soil. The legend of Shadowhand Morgan was about to add its final, most costly chapter. The battle for Crescent Moon Ranch reached its fever pitch as the morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across a landscape transformed by gunsmoke and violence. Miller's men had fortified their positions on the North Ridge, while Morrison's reinforcements pressed hard from the east, trying to break through the Rangers' defensive line. "Ammunition count," Marcus called out, his voice carrying over the chaos of gunfire. He'd positioned himself behind an overturned wagon, the Winchester in his hands, still speaking with deadly precision whenever a target presented itself. "Half full on the Spencer," Hannah reported from her window position. Her face was streaked with gunsmoke, but her hands remained steady. The young woman who'd woken up this morning as a rancher's daughter was proving herself a warrior's heir. Sarah, Matthews crouched nearby, reloading her Colt with practiced efficiency. Running low on pistol rounds, but the rifle's still good. She kept one eye on Morrison, who sat bound and fuming behind the water trough. Daniel's Rangers are holding the east, but they've taken casualties. Marcus nodded grimly, calculating. Options. The hidden caches of ammunition he'd prepared over the years were still accessible, but reaching them meant crossing exposed ground. Marshal Carter, what's your situation? The veteran lawman's voice carried from his position near the barn. Got them bottled up in the canyon to the west, but they're stubborn. Lost 3 good men already. A bullet kicked up splinters near. His head and his rifle answered with authoritative finality. Through the gunsmoke, Marcus caught glimpses of the battle's scope. At least 40 men were engaged in fierce combat across the ranch's carefully prepared killing grounds. Bodies lay, scattered where they'd fallen, the desert soil drinking deep of blood, both honest and corrupt. "Miller's moving!" Hannah's warning came just as the corrupt agent made his bid for freedom. Despite his wounded shoulder, Miller had worked his way down from the ridge, trying to reach Morrison. 3 shots rang out simultaneously, Hannah's, Spencer, Sarah's Colt, and Marcus's Winchester. Miller went down hard, but not before his own gun barked twice. One bullet whined harmlessly overhead, but the other found its mark. Marshal Carter grunted in pain as the shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him against the barn wall. "Cover me!" Marcus shouted, already moving. Years of practicing escapes and tactical movements across his ranch had made him intimately familiar with every angle, every shadow. He reached Carter in seconds, dragging the wounded marshal to better cover as bullets sparked off the ground around them. Getting too old for this. Carter grimaced as Marcus checked his wound. "Remind me why I let Sarah talk me into this plan." "Because John Matthews was your friend too," Marcus replied, tearing strips from his shirt for bandages. "And because Morrison's corruption has gone unpunished too long." A new sound cut through the gunfire, hoofbeats approaching fast from the south. Fresh riders were coming, kicking up dust clouds that reflected the morning sun like signal mirrors. For a moment, both sides seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see if these were reinforcements for law or corruption. "Pa!" Hannah's voice carried recognition and surprise. "It's the Hawthorne Riders, Daniel's father." Sure enough, James Hawthorne led the approaching force, his reputation as one of the territory's most powerful ranchers evident in the quality of horses and men at his command. At least 30 riders, all well-armed and moving with military precision. "Looks like Daniel's message got through," Sarah observed, a smile touching her lips despite the tension. "The honest ranchers are finally taking a stand." Morrison's laugh carried bitter venom. "You think a few ranchers change anything? My reach extends beyond this territory. Even if you win today, others will come. The corruption is too deep, too profitable to die easily." "That's where you're wrong, Charles." Marcus's voice carried absolute certainty. "John Matthews and I didn't just gather evidence against you. We built a network, honest men and women in every territory, waiting for their chance to fight back. Today's not just about Crescent Moon Ranch. It's happening everywhere. Federal marshals are moving on your judges, your bought politicians, your corrupt officials. The cancer you planted is being cut out, root and branch." The governor's face showed the first real fear they'd seen. "You're lying. No one could coordinate. Something that big without me knowing." 20 years is a long time to plan," Sarah replied coldly. "Long enough to turn some of your own men, to plant seeds of resistance in every office you thought you controlled. My father's death wasn't the end of his work, it was the beginning." The Hawthorne Riders reached the ranch's outer perimeter, splitting into practiced groups to engage Morrison's forces from new angles. The effect was immediate and devastating. Caught between the newcomers and the entrenched defenders, the corrupt, gunmen began to waver. "Drop your weapons." James Hawthorne's voice boomed across the battlefield. "This territory's had enough of Morrison's corruption. Any man surrenders now gets fair treatment. Keep fighting, and you'll answer to frontier." "Justice!" The morning wind carried dust and gun smoke across Crescent Moon Ranch as the battle's momentum shifted. One by one, then in groups, Morrison's men began throwing down their weapons. The fight wasn't over. Miller's diehards on the North Ridge still held out, and scattered resistance continued from the more desperate or loyal gunmen, but the tide had turned. "Hannah!" Marcus called out, pride mixing with concern in his voice. "Watch the ridge. Miller's men might try something desperate now that their escape routes are cut off." His daughter's response was two careful shots that sent the ridge defenders ducking for cover. "Already on it, Pa. Though I'm starting to understand why you always said the hardest part of shooting isn't the aim, it's knowing when to hold your fire." Sarah's attention never wavered from Morrison as the governor watched his forces crumble. "You're thinking about what happens next," she observed coldly, "about deals you might make, secrets you might trade. Don't bother. We've got copies of everything, every letter, every transaction, every order for murder or corruption. 20 years of evidence gathered by men and women who never forgot what justice means." The governor's composed mask finally cracked completely. "You can't imagine what you're starting. The powers behind me, the money involved. They'll never let this stand. You'll spend the rest of your lives looking over your shoulders, wondering when the knife will fall." "Maybe," Marcus acknowledged, checking his Winchester's ammunition. "But John Matthews taught me something important. Sometimes the price of doing right is living with the consequences. He died believing that honest men would eventually stand up to corruption. Today proves he was right. The battle was winding down now, the scattered shots becoming more sporadic as Morrison's remaining forces realized the futility of resistance. James Hawthorne's riders had linked up with Daniel's rangers, forming a solid perimeter that no one would break through. But up on the North Ridge, Miller's men weren't quite finished. Even as Marcus watched, they began rolling something into position, something that made his tactical instincts scream warning. "Dynamite!" Hannah's shout carried across the yard. "They're going to try to bring down the whole ridge." The desperate gambit was clear. Miller's men would rather die taking their enemies with them than face justice. The explosion would trigger a landslide that could bury half the ranch, destroying evidence and defenders alike. Time seemed to slow as Marcus Morgan faced one final choice. 20 years of planning, of building this fortress and preparing for this day, had come down to a matter of seconds. The next moments would determine whether justice or corruption ultimately prevailed in these territories. Shadowhand Morgan had one last battle to fight. "Hannah, keep them pinned down!" Marcus shouted, already moving. His Winchester spoke 3 times in rapid succession, forcing Miller's men to duck behind rocks as they tried to light the dynamite fuse. But he knew it was only buying seconds. They were desperate enough to die for their cause. Sarah's Colt added to the covering fire as Marcus raced toward the ridge, using every bit of cover he'd built into his ranch over the years. 2 decades of practicing escape routes and tactical movements were paying off in ways he'd never imagined. "Daniel," he called out, "get those men clear of the ranch house. If that dynamite goes off, the whole north face could come down." The young ranger immediately began organizing an evacuation, proving why he'd earned his badge so young. James Hawthorne's voice carried across the yard. "Morgan, my men can try to flank them from the east." But Marcus knew there wasn't time. The ridge was too steep for horses, and by the time men on foot could get into position, it would be too late. 3 of Miller's men had taken up firing positions to cover the 4th as he worked with the dynamite. Their shots were wild, desperate, but there were enough of them to keep anyone from getting a clean shot at the explosives. "Pa!" Hannah's voice carried equal parts fear and determination. "I can hit the dynamite from here, set it off before. They're ready." "No!" Marcus's response was instant and absolute. Explosion that size, no telling which way the rocks would fall. Too risky. He'd reached the base of the ridge now, using a boulder for cover as he assessed his options. Sarah had worked her way closer, dragging the still-bound Morrison with her. "Marcus, there's a cave entrance 20 yards east. One of your escape routes could get behind them through there." It was a solid plan, but again there wasn't time. Marcus could see one of Miller's men fumbling with matches, trying to light the fuse despite shaking hands. Seconds were all they had left. That's when Hannah proved she was truly her father's daughter. Her Spencer carbine cracked once, not aiming for the dynamite or the men, but at the rocks above them. The shot was perfect, sending a shower of stone fragments raining down. The men instinctively ducked, covering their heads, all except the one with the dynamite, who fumbled and dropped his matches. Marcus didn't waste the opportunity. His Winchester roared as he broke cover, each shot precise despite his movement. 2 of Miller's men went down instantly. The third managed to fire back, his bullet cutting a groove across Marcus's arm, but a shot from Sarah ended his resistance. The last man, the one who'd been handling the dynamite, made a desperate lunge for the fallen matches. 3 guns spoke as one: Hannah's Spencer, Sarah's Colt, and Marcus's Winchester. No one would ever know whose bullet struck true, but it didn't matter. The threat was ended. Silence fell across Crescent Moon Ranch, broken only by the moans of wounded men and the shifting of horses. The battle was over. Morrison's corruption, 20 years in the making, had been broken in a single morning. Marcus climbed carefully to secure the dynamite, his movements watched by friend and foe alike. The legend of Shadow Hand Morgan had been reborn today, but it was different now. Not just a tale of a deadly gunman, but of justice long delayed. Finally being served. "It's done," he called down to the others. "Miller's dead, his men too." There was no satisfaction in his voice, only the weariness that comes after necessary violence. Sarah Matthews looked at her father's killer, now thoroughly defeated. "John Matthews died trying to expose your corruption, Morrison." But he didn't die for nothing. Everything he built, everything he planned, it worked exactly as he hoped. The good men stayed good. The corrupt ones showed their true colors, and justice finally caught up with everyone. James Hawthorne approached, his presence commanding respect even in victory. Federal marshals are already moving through the territory. Morgan, every judge, every official, every lawman Morrison corrupted, they're all being rounded up. 20 years of darkness being brought to light in a single day. Hannah had come down from her position, the Spencer carbine still held competently, but no longer needed. She looked at her father with new understanding. All those lessons, all those rules about staying hidden and safe, you were preparing for this day all along. Marcus nodded, finally letting the legendary gunman's deadly grace fade slightly. Preparing you too, though I hoped it wouldn't be necessary. Some legacies are better left buried. He looked at Sarah. Your father understood that. It's why he helped me disappear, why he spent years building this network of honest men and women. Network that's still growing, Daniel added, pride evident in his voice. Words spreading across the territories. Honest people are finally standing up, telling what they know about Morrison's corruption. The cancers being cut out, root and branch. The morning sun had climbed high over Crescent Moon Ranch, casting no shadows where secrets could hide. Justice, long delayed but never defeated, had finally been served. But as Marcus Morgan looked at the cost, the dead and wounded scattered. Across his ranch, he wondered what price they would all pay for victory. The legend of Shadow Hand Morgan would live on, but perhaps now it would be a story of redemption rather than revenge. A tale of how justice, though slow, was still stronger than corruption. The war wasn't over. Morrison had been right about that. There would be others who would try to rebuild his corrupt empire, but they would find themselves facing not just a legendary gunman, but a network of honest men and women determined to keep their territories clean. The shadow had lifted from Crescent Moon Ranch, but the real work of justice was just beginning. In the hours following the battle, Crescent Moon Ranch transformed from a fortress to a center of operations. U.S. Marshals processed prisoners while Rangers tended to the wounded. The dead, both honest and corrupt, were laid out with equal dignity, covered by blankets in the shade of the barn. Marcus Morgan stood on his porch, watching the organized chaos with experienced eyes. His Winchester remained close at hand. Old habits died hard, especially today. Sarah Matthews approached, her father's badge now pinned properly to her vest after 20 years of keeping it hidden. "Federal judge is riding in from Fort Gibson," she reported, her voice carrying the weight of command she'd inherited from John Matthews. "Should be here by sunset. Morrison won't be able to buy or threaten his way out of this one." "Assuming he lives that long," Marcus observed, noting how several of Morrison's captured men were eyeing their former employer. "Men like him make enemies even among their allies." His attention shifted to where Hannah and Daniel worked together, helping. Marshal Carter organized the seized evidence. Sarah followed his gaze. "She handled herself well today. John would have liked her, said similar things about me at that age." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Though I didn't have quite her aim with a Spencer." "Had a good teacher," Daniel commented as he joined them, carrying a stack of documents retrieved from Morrison's saddlebags. "Though I'm starting to think those basic safety lessons weren't quite what they seemed." Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "Every lesson serves multiple purposes, if you know how to teach it." His eyes scanned the horizon automatically, checking approaches out of decades of habit. "Found anything interesting in those papers?" Daniel's expression turned grave. "More than we expected. Morrison wasn't just corrupting these territories. He was laying groundwork for something bigger, some kind of plan involving the railroad companies, land speculation, even foreign investors." "Makes sense," Sarah added, her investigator's mind working through implications. "A man like Morrison doesn't think small. He was building an empire piece by piece. These territories were just the beginning." A rider approached from the east, kicking up dust as he pushed his horse hard. One of James Hawthorne's men, Marcus noted, recognizing the way he sat his saddle. The rider pulled up short of the porch, his face carrying urgent news. "Mr. Morgan, got word from town. Telegrams coming, in from all over the territory. Seems Morrison's men are making their moves. Some running, some trying to destroy evidence. Judge Whitaker in Silver Creek just tried to burn down his own courthouse." Marcus exchanged glances with Sarah and Daniel. "They're panicking. Good. Means they don't know how much evidence we already have." He turned to Daniel. "Get word to your rangers. Anyone trying to flee the territory needs to be stopped." "Already on it," the young lawman assured him. "Set up checkpoints at every major crossing. Even have some of Hawthorne's men watching the back trails. Nobody's slipping away this time." Sarah studied the documents in Daniel's hands. "We need to organize all this. Letters, ledgers, telegraph records. Build a case that will stand up in any court, no matter how much pressure Morrison's friends try to apply." "Use my study," Marcus offered. "Been preparing it for just this purpose." At their questioning looks, he elaborated. "Hidden compartments in the walls, reinforced door, clear fields of fire from multiple positions. John helped me design it. Back when we first started gathering evidence." Hannah approached, her Spencer carbine still carried with casual competence. "Pa, Marshal Carter wants to know what to do with Miller's men who survived. Says they're asking to talk, claiming they have information about other operations." Marcus considered this. Miller's surviving men would know details about Morrison's network that even their gathered evidence might not reveal. But they were also dangerous, dedicated to corruption in a way that made them unpredictable. "Keep them separate from the other prisoners," he decided. "Post extra guards, men you trust completely. And Hannah—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Stay away from them. Men like that backed into a corner. They're never more dangerous than when they seem cooperative." "Speaking from experience?" she asked, a new understanding in her eyes as she looked at her father. "Speaking from 20 years of watching corrupt men try to save themselves," he replied. "Your safety matters more than any information they might provide." James Hawthorne rode up, his presence commanding attention without effort. The rancher had proved himself a valuable ally, his men's intervention turning the tide of battle. "Morgan, got riders coming in from the north, look like army. Regulars this time. Real ones, not more of Morrison's masked men." Marcus nodded slowly. The army's involvement was inevitable once word of the battle spread. Morrison's corruption had touched military contracts, supply lines, even troop movements. Some officers would be implicated, others would want to help. "Clean house. Sarah," he called out, "get word to Marshal Carter. Any officer who arrives needs to see the evidence about military contracts first. Show them what Morrison was really doing with those supply lines." He turned to Daniel. "Your rangers still watching the high ground?" "Every approach covered," Daniel confirmed. "Won't be any surprises like Miller's men again." His hand unconsciously touched the grip of his revolver, a gesture Marcus recognized from his own years of staying constantly ready. A commotion from the prisoner area drew their attention. Morrison was demanding to speak with someone in authority, his composed mask finally cracking completely. Sarah's hand dropped to her Colt, but Marcus waved her down. "Let him talk," he advised. "Men like Morrison, when they finally break, that's when they reveal the most. Every secret they spill weakens what's left of their power." They approached the bound governor carefully, aware that even defeated snakes could still strike. Morrison looked up at them, his expensive clothes now dust-covered and bloody from the battle. "You have no idea what you've started," he spat, desperation evident in his voice. "The men behind me, the money involved, they won't let this stand. Everything you've built, everyone you care about, they'll destroy it all." Marcus studied the man who'd corrupted 3 territories, who'd ordered John Matthews' death, who'd turned the law itself into a weapon against justice. "Maybe," he acknowledged quietly, "but John Matthews taught me something important about men like you, Charles. You think money and power make you strong, make you untouchable. But real strength comes from standing up for what's right no matter the cost. Right no matter." Sarah's voice carried her father's steel. "Those men behind you, the ones you think will save you, they're already running. Every hour brings new telegrams, new reports of your allies trying to flee or destroy evidence. Your empire's falling, apart, piece by piece. And we're going to help it fall," Daniel added, his young face hard with purpose. "Every corrupt judge, every bought lawman, every crooked politician, they'll all face justice. Just like you." Morrison's face twisted with fury and fear. "You fool! You think this ends with me? There are others, bigger players with plans you can't imagine. What I built here, what you're destroying, is just one small part of something much larger." Marcus felt pieces clicking into place in his mind. Morrison's words confirmed suspicions he'd harbored for years, suspicions that John Matthews had died trying to prove. The corruption in these territories wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger design, a pattern that stretched far beyond their borders. The legendary gunman studied the fallen governor, seeing not just a corrupt official, but a piece in a larger game. Shadowhand Morgan had helped end Morrison's reign of corruption, but the real battle, the one John Matthews had foreseen, was just beginning. "What exactly are you trying to say, Morrison?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying deadly calm. "What larger design?" The governor's laugh held bitter triumph despite his situation. "You think cleaning up these territories changes anything? The railroads are coming, Morgan. With them comes money, power, and men who make me look like a small-town shopkeeper. Everything I built here was just preparation, laying groundwork for what's coming." Sarah's hand tightened on her Colt. "The railroad contracts, the land deals. It wasn't just about immediate profit, was it?" "Finally, someone asks the right question," Morrison sneered. 20 years we spent, positioning everything perfectly. Every corrupt judge, every bought official, all placed exactly where they'll be needed when the real work begins." Daniel exchanged glances with Marcus. "The Eastern investors, Hannah, found records of in your saddlebags. They're part of this." "Parts of parts," Morrison replied cryptically. "Wheels within wheels, all turning to a plan you can't even comprehend. Kill me, arrest me, destroy everything I built, won't matter. Others will step in, continue the work. Progress can't be stopped, and progress needs Guidance. Marcus felt old instincts stirring, the same instincts that had kept him alive. Through countless gunfights now warned him that Morrison's words carried deadly weight. The governor wasn't just trying to save himself. He was revealing something bigger, perhaps without even realizing it. John knew, Sarah breathed, understanding dawning in her eyes. That's why they killed him when they did. He wasn't just investigating local corruption. He'd seen the larger pattern. Your father was always too clever for his own good, Morrison confirmed. Started connecting pieces that were supposed to stay separate. Railroad routes, land purchases, military contracts. He saw how it all fit together. Had to be stopped before he could warn anyone. Hannah, who had been listening intently, spoke up. The strongbox in Pa's room. The evidence you and John Matthews gathered. It's not just about Morrison's crimes, is it? Marcus nodded slowly. John was building a bigger case. Everything we gathered here, everything we protected, it's evidence of something much larger than one corrupt governor. He turned to Sarah. Your father died protecting more than just these territories. He died trying to expose a conspiracy that could reshape the entire frontier. Morrison's smile was cold as a desert night. Now you're beginning to understand, but it's too late. The wheels are already turning. What's coming? It's inevitable. James Hawthorne, who had joined them during this exchange, spoke up. Nothing's inevitable except justice, Morrison. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it comes for everyone eventually. Brave words, Morrison scoffed. But the men I work for, they play a longer game. They measure time in decades, profits in millions. You really think your frontier, justice can touch them? Marcus shared a long look with Sarah, seeing John Matthews' determination in her eyes. No, he said finally. Frontier justice won't be enough. That's why we'll have to be smarter, plan better, build something stronger than just law enforcement. Daniel caught his meaning first. A network, like what we built to take down Morrison, but bigger, connecting honest men and women across territories, sharing information, gathering evidence. Following the money, Sarah added, her investigators. Mind working through implications, tracking land deals, contracts, movements of power, just like my father taught us. Morrison's face showed the first real concern they'd seen. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected to his revelations. Instead of fear or despair, these people were already planning their response, adapting their strategies to face the larger threat. Marcus turned to Hannah, seeing not just his daughter now, but a potential ally in the coming fight. Those shooting lessons aren't over, girl. Seems we've got more work ahead than I thought. Hannah's smile was fierce as a desert hawk's. Good thing you taught me to be patient then, to wait for the right moment, just like you did all these years. The sun climbed higher over Crescent Moon Ranch as plans began forming. Morrison's empire of corruption was broken, but something larger loomed on the horizon. The legend of Shadowhand Morgan would need to evolve once again. Not just a story of vengeance or justice, but of protecting the frontier itself from men who would turn progress into profit at any cost. The real war was just beginning. The sun set over Crescent Moon Ranch 1 week after the battle that had changed everything. Morrison and his surviving men were headed to federal prison, escorted by Marshal Carter himself. The evidence gathered over 20 years would ensure justice was finally served. Marcus Morgan stood on his porch, watching the last golden rays. Paint the desert in shades of fire. Hannah approached, the Spencer carbine still carried with the confidence she'd earned in battle. Army patrol just left, she reported. Said they'll keep extra forces in the territory until things settle. Daniel's Rangers are escorting Judge Whitaker to his trial tomorrow. And Sarah, heading to Washington with the federal marshals, says she'll make sure every piece of evidence reaches the right hands. Hannah studied her father's face. She's really John Matthews' daughter, isn't she? Same determination to see justice done, Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of years lifting. John would be proud of her. Proud of you too. You handled yourself like a true lawman's daughter when it mattered. Most. Learned from the best. Hannah's smile carried new understanding, though I'm still not sure which lessons were about ranching and which were about being Shadowhand Morgan's heir. Both. Neither. Everything I taught you was about doing what's right, no matter the cost. He touched the Winchester that had helped build his legend. This life, the violence, the secrets, I never wanted it for you, but I wanted you ready if it ever found you. James Hawthorne rode up, his presence still commanding respect. Morgan, got word from town. Morrison's network is falling apart. Across 3 territories. Every day brings new arrests, new evidence coming to light. And the bigger threat he mentioned? The men behind him? Still out there, Hawthorne acknowledged. But they'll find these territories changed. Harder to corrupt, better defended. Thanks to you, to all of us who chose to stand against them. Daniel appeared from the barn, his ranger's badge catching the last sunlight. Sir, we found something else in Morrison's papers. Plans for what they intended. It's bigger than we thought. The railroads, the land deals, it was all part of something massive. Marcus studied the young man who'd helped bring down an empire of corruption. Then we'll be ready, build our own network just like John Matthews taught us. Keep the frontier honest, one territory at a time. Hannah's hand found Daniel's, their shared experiences having forged something stronger than romance. Pa, what happens to Crescent Moon Ranch now, to everything you built here? Marcus smiled, seeing not just his fortress, but a legacy in the making. It becomes what it was always meant to be, a waypoint for justice, a place where honest men and women can find allies, share information, prepare for the battles ahead. Shadowhand Morgan's last gift to the frontier, Sarah Matthews said, approaching from the house. She'd delayed her departure to Washington for this moment. My father would have liked that. The setting sun cast long shadows across Crescent Moon Ranch as Marcus Morgan, no longer hiding behind any facade, looked at the family fate had given him. Hannah and Daniel, representing the next generation of frontier justice. Sarah Matthews, carrying her father's legacy forward. James Hawthorne and his honest ranchers, proving that good men would stand against corruption when called. The legend of Shadowhand. Morgan was about vengeance, he said finally. But what we built here, what we'll keep building, that's about justice, about making sure good people have a chance against the darkness. The desert wind carried promise as night fell over Crescent Moon Ranch. The shadow had lifted, but the work of justice never truly ended. And in the years to come, whenever corruption threatened the frontier, honest men and women would find their way to a certain ranch, where an old legend had learned that the greatest victory wasn't in defeating evil, but in inspiring good. The sun set on Shadowhand Morgan's last battle, but his true legacy was just beginning.